So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about data subject access rights. Data access is the ability for a person to retrieve their personal data upon request. And the right for a consumer to have this access to their data has been, for like decades now, a critical component of US and international privacy regulation. It shows up in things like the 1974 US Privacy Act. It was also one of 8 of the OECD privacy principles in 1980. And if we fast forward several decades, it was both covered by the GDPR, CCPA, and pretty much any piece of state or national legislation that has come out since then. So this principle shows up pretty much everywhere in the world of privacy. And intuitively, it might seem like being able to access the data that a company has collected about you would be super useful in terms of privacy. But as I'm going to show in this talk, making data access useful is not actually that straightforward at all. If you wanted to exercise your right of access, you'd usually do that through a data subject access request, or DSAR, which usually goes something like this. As a user, you'd send an access request to a company. That company would collect all your personal data over a few hours, days, weeks, or maybe a month, and will make that data into a collection of files. Those files will then get sent back to you in the form of a data export, which is usually just made up of 1 or more zip files. And how one makes a DSAR varies quite a bit from company to company. It could be super simple, like just clicking a button on your settings page, or it could be a highly configurable process where you get to pick exactly what gets exported and somehow even how it gets exported. Just like with the DSARs, data exports also vary quite a bit. It could be a single PDF with this jumble of information here, or it could be an interactive HTML file that gives you some explanation about what data you're looking at. But more often than not, it'll always include just a bunch of files. And previous work in this area has shown that consumers are pretty confused and overwhelmed by DSARs and these exports. And so in this work, we tried to dig into a little bit more as to why that is the case. Mainly, we asked 4 research questions. So we wanted to know, how complex are these data exports? What questions do users want their data exports to answer? How effective are these exports at communicating information? And finally, what actions do users really want to take after they're done exploring their exports? And I'll be talking about the last 3 today. To answer these questions, we had our 33 participants make at least 1 DSAR in one of 5 major companies. We then asked them to think about what they'd want answered by the data before they even looked at it. We then walked them through a data annotation exercise on a tool that we built specifically for this study, and I'm going to go over that later. Then we showed them the questions from the beginning that they asked and asked them to reflect on how well they were answered. And then finally, they submitted the questions, annotations, reflections, and the data export itself after going through our pseudonymization pipeline. So let's dig into what participants wanted to know, so what their questions were, and how well they were answered. The most common category of questions were about the platform itself. So questions that were about data storage practices and things like record retention, something like, is my data anonymous, were answered pretty successfully. However, when these questions were about business practices, like does Uber sell client data to telemarketers, those questions weren't as readily available. Second, participants wanted to know if the platform was tracking specific record types. When these record types were generic, something like location or login times, they were pretty easily found. But whenever they were more esoteric, something like audio recordings, participants weren't as comfortable or easy finding them. Finally, the last category of questions were where the users wanted to learn about themselves and their platform usage. When these questions were closed-ended, something like, what's my most frequently visited website, answers were pretty easily found there. Usually, though, these questions were about trends, patterns, and high-level syntheses of their data. Like, if my IP address changed, would Spotify's recommendations to me change? And these higher-level questions were not answered very well. So our participants are done asking their questions, and now they finally get to look at their data. First, I'm going to go over the tool that we built for participants to explore and interact with their data. And then I'll go over what was in their annotations, so their reactions to it. And for the rest of the talk, I'll be using my own data exports just because they aren't redacted or pseudonymized at all. After you uploaded your data export as a participant to our tool, you'd be able to sift through files or search for specific keywords in your export. Once you picked a file, you'd see its content and be able to jump around between different parts of that file. We'd then ask you to select or highlight the bits in that file that stood out to you. And then we'd ask you to tell us why these bits stood out to you in the first place, as an annotation here on the left side of the screen. So dozens of the annotations we found revealed to us that users were pretty confused and overwhelmed by the data. For many, this overwhelm came from just the sheer number of files and folders that were in their export. Even so, when a participant was able to find a file they were looking at, they still sometimes got stuck. So take this JSON file, for example, which has a series of keys and values, kind of like a dictionary. When records had keys that didn't have an obvious meaning, so something like ent field name over here, they wouldn't be able to interpret what they were looking at. And sometimes this lack of clarity was more than just a barrier to their comprehension of the files. It actually resulted in distrust towards the company. So in this same file, for example, it's not super clear why Facebook would need to keep track of every single emoji I've ever used and when I used it. And whenever our participants uncovered these hidden records and settings, they wanted them gone ASAP. They wanted them deleted. But interestingly, no one really mentioned wanting to delete their account per se. Instead, what they wanted was to delete bits and pieces of data here and there. On top of that, users were much more comfortable with data being in the export if they could find a reasonable explanation for why that data was there. So just in the emoji case, for example, this could be something like explaining that Facebook Messenger has an emoji recommendation system, and so they need to know which emojis you use the most. The last chunk of annotations I want to talk about today are those where participants learned about themselves, were amused in some way, or even experienced nostalgia. So one user thought that the categories Spotify attached to them were pretty funny and amusing. So like here in my Spotify data, where I guess they were able to identify me as Gen Z. Others expressed fondness when specific records triggered specific memories. So an example in my export could be something like going through the liked pages on Facebook and remembering, oh yeah, in 2017, I went to my first hackathon with my best friend, and I guess for some reason liked that page on Facebook afterwards. Okay, so now we know what participants want from their data, and we know some of the reasons that they're not getting it through these barriers that we talked about. And so for the rest of the talk, I'll go into a discussion about what we can do to improve data exports at the policy and industry level. In our analysis, we uncovered a pretty fundamental tension at the heart of how privacy legislation has handled the right of access. This tension is that machine readability and human accessibility are often at odds with each other and almost incompatible. So if we want exports to be more accessible to users, rich interactions and data explanations have to be as much of a priority as machine readability and portability. So with this in mind, we developed 3 key features for designers and developers that would help improve this experience with data exports. So the first of these features tackles data definitions. So this is 300,000 lines into my Spotify streaming history from last year. And while it would be pretty useful, and it is useful to have a PDF file alongside this file that lists exactly what each of these keys mean and the values that they could take, these definitions could also live alongside the records themselves. Or even better, what if we just represented the same information in a way that was accessible to the average user, like in this mock-up we made for this talk? Our second suggestion tackles the overwhelming experience that our participants had interacting with their data. The searching and filtering capabilities that we built into our tool, we discovered, were pretty crucial for users to access all their data in a digestible way. Interestingly, though, users were pretty suspicious and noticed whenever data they thought would be there was missing. Therefore, it's just as important that users have access to each record in its exhaustive form and have the ability to toggle between this verbose representation of the data and a high-level summarized representation of that data. Finally, Our participants wanted to exercise their other privacy rights, namely of deletion and modification while they were exploring their data. Right now, the main way to do this formally is by sending a data deletion request that kind of gets rid of your whole account and all your data. But users often don't want to leave a platform entirely, like I mentioned before. What they want is surgical precision in data deletion. So for our third feature, we recommend embedding the ability to do just that, so deletions and modifications, in the exploration interface itself. So this would increase trust in the platform and could actually make users want to stay there rather than leave. So to close off the talk, a question we had earlier on in this project was whether or not improving DSARs and data exports would even be useful. Like, would people even use these if they were better? And we think they would. So I'm sure you've heard of something like Spotify Wrapped, or at least something like it by now, but if not, it's this interactive data review experience that provides users with interesting and kind of exciting ways for them to see their activity over a year. In addition to Spotify, other companies have been building these Wrapped-like experiences for their users. Like Letterboxd does this for movies once a year, and Belly does this for restaurants about once a month. People on the internet are doing the same thing. So they're building things like mock festival lineups based on your music listening history, and interactive Sankey plots that show you how popular you are on Tinder, for example. This is something we found in our study as well. Users had pretty positive experiences when uncovering meaningful records. So we can therefore leverage these types of personal data discovery experiences to promote a user's engagement with other parts of their personal data as well, say like their privacy settings. Future work in this area that we've actually already started explores what a Wrapped-like experience would look like for things like data privacy and transparency. So to wrap things up, I talked about our study where we looked into how people perceive their current data exports and data access rights and provided some suggestions for how we can improve data exports for users. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions now.